My name is Kyuhee Han, and I'm an attorney with the Housing and Economic Rights Advocates. Today, our webinar is on reasonable accommodations and emotional support animals. We have our admin team here, and Favi is helping me with the slides today. Um, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands, or you can also put your questions in the chat and we'll be periodically checking those. Also the slides will be available in Spanish. Cassie has generously translated all of the slides in Spanish, so those will be available after the presentation as well. Okay. Favi, can we get to the next slide, please? So emotional support animals are different from service animals. Service animals provide services such as medical services. Emotional support animals are not trained, whereas service animals are trained. So emotional support animals are there, just as their description says, to emotionally support the tenant or the employee. Next slide, please. So tenants with disabilities have the right to keep a service animal in their care under California's Fair Employment and Housing Act. For rental housing, ESAs are also allowed under California Civil Code, Section 51, and the Disabled Persons Act. If you're applying to or live in a HUD assistant housing, such as Section 8, you also have the right to an ESA under the Federal Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504. ESAs must be a dog or actually any animal that is trained for disability-related work and tasks and does not pose a direct threat to others or fundamentally change the nature of the housing. So when I say trained, they don't necessarily have to be trained in terms of being able to do certain acts. It's more like they are trained to calm the person, to reassure the person who is asking for the ESA. Next slide, please. A direct threat is defined on a case-by-case basis and cannot be defined by the breed only. So for example, I know pit bulls are generally considered to be really aggressive, but a landlord cannot say that just because you have a pit bull, that cannot be an ESA animal. That animal has to be looked at and assessed on an individual basis. The animals should not be a danger or nuisance to the community. If you have, in particular, exotic animals, they will be looked at closely because some exotic animals could be a danger to the health and safety of other tenants. Next slide, please. Landlords are only allowed to ask 2 questions related to ESAs. Number 1, if the animal is required due to the tenant's disability. And number 2, what tasks or work has the animal been trained to perform? The ESAs can also be asked for as a reasonable accommodation due to the tenant's disability, and we'll get to those slides in a few minutes. Even if you don't ask for a reasonable accommodation ESA, it might be wise to let your landlord, your HOA, or your property manager know just in case any issues come up later. For example, some places may not need a letter for cats as opposed to needing a letter for dogs, but it would still be prudent to have a letter on hand or to let the landlord or the HOA or the property manager know just in case. If you do ask for an ESA as a reasonable accommodation, the landlord may ask you for documentation that shows you have a disability. Next slide, please. And next slide. If your pet qualifies as an ESA, you can override a landlord's no pet policy. You should also not be charged extra for an ESA, so the landlord should not be charging you higher rent or a security deposit. And there should be no requirement for you to buy insurance to keep the ESA. If your landlord denies your request for an ESA, you can file complaints here at the links that have been listed. Next slide, please. So for reasonable accommodations are exceptions to rules that allow a disabled tenant to have the same use and enjoyment of his or her property that a non-disabled tenant has. So reasonable modifications are physical alterations of the interior of the unit that is necessary to provide the disabled tenant with an equal opportunity to use and enjoy his or her home. So an accommodation is deemed reasonable if it is not an undue financial burden to the landlord, does not require a fundamental change in the housing nature, or does not create a health and safety risk for others. The law also defines a person as disabled if he or she has a physical or mental impairment that limits participation in a major life activity, such as seeing, breathing, self-care, or manual tasks, or as a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Next slide, please. The tenant has a responsibility to request the accommodation verbally or in writing. Writing is always preferred whenever you're communicating with a landlord or HOA or property manager, just in terms of legal situations that may arise in the future. So the request does not have to reveal what disability you have, but it does have to say, number one, how the physical or mental disability impairs with your ability to do major life activities. And number two, how the accommodation will mitigate the effects of your disability. So if you get a letter from your medical provider, it does not have to say what disability you have. The request does not have to reveal what disability you have, but it should say that it should say how your physical and mental disability impairs with your ability to do major life activities and how the accommodation will mitigate the effects of your disabilities. Next slide. More facts. So even if a landlord says no, he or she still has to actively engage with you to discuss the request and try to find a different way to accommodate you. So examples of reasonable accommodations could be having an ESA when there is a no pet policy, allowing you to move to a ground floor apartment if you have a physical disability that prevents you from going upstairs, reserving a closer parking space if you have a physical disability or you require a wheelchair, giving you more time to move out if you have a severe physical or mental disability. Some examples of reasonable modifications include installing ramps for wheelchairs, widening doors to allow space for wheelchair access, and removing or lowering cabinets in bathroom or the kitchen to allow easy access. Next slide, please.
I think that is the end of the slides.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions about ESAs or reasonable accommodations? I don't see anything in the chat. But I think the major takeaways are that if you have an emotional support animal or you are in need of an emotional support animal, that you want to get that documentation and that request to your landlord, HOA, or your property manager as soon as you can, so that they can assess the animal and they can also talk to you about the request. You should not be getting charged extra for having that ESA once that's approved. And for reasonable accommodations that are not related to emotional support animals, the landlord has to, under California law, actively engage with you and discuss what are some of the options. So if they're unable to grant that specific accommodation request, then they do have to discuss with you what some other options that might be available to you. And if there are any other questions, you can contact our office, and the slides will be available. The slides will also be available in Spanish as well, if you're a non-English speaker. Thank you.
QV, it looks like Michael has a quick question.
Oh, sure.
It says, maybe this is outside our scope. How do ESAs work when it comes to roommates? For example, can one roommate refuse to accept another roommate's attempt to bring in an ESA to a shared unit, or how about neighbors?
That's a really good question, Michael. I actually haven't encountered too many roommate situations with ESAs. Um, so I would have to look into that more, but I would discuss it with the landlord first because the landlord, there may be a situation. So, for example, if it's a dorm, you can talk to the advisor, and then it may be possible to switch. Uh, Rooms so that you can have a solo room, or you can get a new roommate who would be okay with having the ESA. um, and as far as neighbors, um, the neighbor, as long as the emotional support animal is not a danger to that neighbor, um, you should be able to have that ESA.
I have a quick question actually about getting your emotional support animal registered. What is the process, or like what qualifies as a valid way to get an animal registered? And then how is the landlord able to basically say if that's good enough?
That's a great question too, Bobby. ESAs do not have to be registered. That's another difference with service animals. It would really be assessing the individual animal, their personality, and then seeing, the documentation from your medical provider on how that particular animal is able to mitigate the disability that you have. So, for example, if you have anxiety issues, and having an emotional support dog will ease a lot of that anxiety, um, then that would be something that your medical provider would be able to put in that letter. Also, I wanted to make note that when I say medical provider, it could be a doctor. It could be a psychologist, as well as a therapist. So they don't necessarily have to be an MD to provide letter for an emotional support animal.
Thanks for answering that, QV. And then when you get that letter and present it to your landlord, should that be enough proof to have the animal in the unit, even if it's a no pet policy?
Yes. Yeah. Mhm.
Cool.
Are there any questions? So if no other questions, I think we can end the presentation. Um, yeah, the slides will be available. Anyone on the tenant team will be really knowledgeable about other questions about reasonable accommodations and ESAs.
Thank you, QV. I'm going to go ahead and end this now, but thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
Really.
Thank you, everyone, for everything, not just coming and, um, you know, just all the help that you do behind the scenes on a daily basis. It's not just me, everyone appreciates all of you. So thank you.
We'll miss you, Kiwi. We'll be in touch. All right. Bye, everyone.